Hello, we're here this afternoon with John-Clark Levin. John-Clark is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College in a double major, linguistics, and a second major, which is philosophy, politics, and economics. We could ask a little bit later about what all that is. And he's currently working on a master's in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at that little college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think it's called Harvard. So welcome, John-Clark.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you.
John-Clark is also the author, he's a very young man, but he's the author of a book called Private Anti-Piracy Navies, How Warships for Hire Are Changing Maritime Security. And I kind of prepared for this interview, or partly by watching Captain Phillips last night, so I feel like I'm an expert. Not really. So, John-Clark, can you tell us about the book?
Yes, so this book is about how the private maritime security industry has developed in response to the epidemics of maritime piracy, first off Somalia on the east coast of Africa, and then in the Gulf of Guinea off West Africa more recently. Specifically then, the book looks at some of those companies which provide actual private escort vessels, which have been dubbed private navies, even though that's not a completely accurate term. It sums up really a startling insight about what's going on, namely that vessels that are effectively warships are, for the first time in a few centuries, under the command of private sector entities. So the book looks at the legal and operational and economic impacts of this trend, and also some of the complications that arise then when private actors are in positions to use lethal force and have to make very difficult decisions about when to do so.
Well, John-Clark, how did this book come to be written? Because I don't think it's typical that a college graduate from a four-year degree writes a book about piracy, let alone about anything.
Well, this started with an undergraduate fellowship I did while at Claremont McKenna College. It was through the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies, which is essentially a foreign policy think tank at Claremont McKenna. And that fellowship resulted in about a 25-page research paper, which I completed at the end of my junior year. And the following summer, I realized that I had only scratched the surface of the topic, so wrote to an academic publisher, seeing if they wanted to turn it into a full-length book, and to make a very long story short, they said yes.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
So how did you find that publisher?
I searched online for publishers of books that were roughly similar.
Mm-hmm.
And I found two publishers that seemed to fit the bill and queried them both simultaneously. With one of them, the email bounced back, and so I don't think they ever got it. And with the other, the acquisitions editor really liked the project, and that's the publisher that I ultimately moved forward with.
Fantastic. Did you have to write one of those full-length book proposals?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And how did you find that? I think that's daunting for some people.
Well, it was a big help that I had already done so much research on it over the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
So I was familiar with the issue itself and how it affected other trends going on in the world, and I had a strong sense of what I wanted to say in the book, both from the material that I put in the fellowship paper and also the material that I had to cut from it. So I already had a good sense of what the roadmap would be going forward, and so when it came time to actually pitch that to the publisher, I could do so with a good deal of confidence.
So you knew your topic well. Now you worked with a co-writer. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so my co-author is Professor John J. Pitney Jr. He is one of the top professors at Claremont McKenna College and is just adored by all of his students. Unfortunately, I never actually got to take a class with him, but I consider that this collaboration was just as good, if not better.
Do you think that was a factor in the book finding a publisher?
Yes, yes, it certainly was, because in the academic market, publishers are keen to see that authors have PhDs, and the wealth of experience that Professor Pitney could bring to the table, not just through the degree itself, but having written several very successful books before himself, he could really guide me through the process, alert me to the pitfalls before I stepped into them, and was a steady hand on the tiller throughout the project.
Well, I think that points to maybe a principle or a practice that would be good for aspiring writers to know, which is an aspiring writer can team up with an expert or a champion or someone that's great in their field. I mean, your experience was, I think, I've had a similar experience of finding someone who was really eminent and also approachable.
Yes.
And in fact, happy to work on a project where maybe somebody else did a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yes, well, it's a good area for collaboration because within nonfiction, at least, even well regarded experts in a given field won't know everything about whatever specialty you want to write on.
Mm-hmm.
And so publishers are keen to see that balance, I think, between someone who is doing a lot of specific research or on the ground data gathering or nitty gritty fine tooth comb sort of work.
Mm-hmm.
And then also someone with the experience of actually having put together a book before and understanding the sort of commitment that it takes and the work that goes into it. So if you bring one of those things to the table, pairing with a co-author who can contribute the other can, I think, be a very good way to convince publishers that you are the right team for the job.
I think you said a whole bunch of really golden words in there, John-Clark, that I'm going to listen to again. Can you give us an overview of your educational career up to this point?
Yes, so I am a native of Ojai, California, just about an hour north of Los Angeles, and attended the Ojai Valley School there. And after Ojai Valley School, I homeschooled for a year through the Laurel Springs School, which is also actually based in Ojai. And then I started high school at Villanova Preparatory School, also in Ojai, where we met. And then after that, went to Claremont McKenna and am now at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you. Can you talk about those two degrees? Like, what is a linguistics degree, and then what about that tripart degree you also got there?
Yes. Well, when I tell people that I majored in linguistics, a lot of them ask as their next question, oh, so do you want to be a translator? Or what languages did you learn? And that's a common misconception about linguistics, that people think it's just learning lots of languages. By contrast, some of the top linguists working today only speak one language, because really the field centers not on learning languages themselves, but rather looking under the hood, so to speak, and seeing what makes all languages work. What are the commonalities and universals in language, and how does that tie in then to other fields? So linguistics has a lot of crossover with psychology and sociology, and in some cases even math. So what I found so useful about that was that linguistics offered me a great lens for looking at a lot of the political rhetoric in the world today and just how our minds interact with human language. As far as the philosophy, politics, and economics degree, or PPE, that was derived from an old innovation at Oxford, which came about after the educators there realized that classics degrees were no longer sufficient to teach the young men of Oxford at that time to run the British Empire. And so the thinking was, if you could marry those three subjects, they could inform each other and provide an education that was greater than the sum of the parts. In that, if you understand politics, you can then grasp how economics can actually be implemented, and you can understand how philosophy can be instantiated in civil society. And if you understand philosophy, then you grasp some of the forces that make economics work and that make politics work. And if you understand economics, then that gives you insight into philosophy and politics. So with those strong and interwoven threads of education, I felt I was able to get some good perspective, not just on the world as it is, but similar to the linguistics, looking under the hood and seeing what the most fundamental forces are to our society.
Well, I guess the question I have there is, John-Clark, how did a kid who was maybe 18 think of that?
In what sense?
Well, you chose a major that lets you integrate philosophy, politics, and economics. It took some pretty deep thinking to see that those could be interrelated and that you might be able to interrelate them and to do something with them.
Well, don't give me too much credit. I mean, the program was already designed there at Claremont McKenna. So with that program, perhaps it would help to talk a little bit about it. There were 14 people in my cohort, and we took all of our PPE classes together. And that took the form of tutorials on the Oxford-Cambridge model, where we would write weekly papers and then meet with one fellow student and a professor and talk about our papers and critique them and deliver them. And then also intimate seminar-style classes where we would engage through discussion the issues in that week's readings. So it was a very intense experience and allowed us to really grapple in depth with issues in a way that I think is quite rare in undergraduate education today.
It is. I think that sounds tremendous, the Oxford model. Do you have any thoughts about what might be next for you educationally?
Well, I still have about half a year to make a decision in that direction, but I am at this point looking at doctoral programs and trying to figure out what might be the best next step.
All right. Now, how about a little outline of your history as a writer, John-Clark?
Well, when I was probably about 6 years old, I made the decision that I would write a book at some point, but it got put off and put off, what with schooling and other activities that consumed my immediate attention. And so in the meanwhile, then, most of the writing I did was for school, although I did get a chance to occasionally write either fiction or poetry just for my own interest in my spare time. But then by the time I got to Claremont, I started more seriously getting into academic writing and started submitting articles to journals, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And from that, then, I got a sense of what it would really take to write the book that I wrote on piracy and private security.
Now, you've done some writing for the Wall Street Journal, isn't that correct?
Oh, yes. Yes, that's also the case. When I started at Claremont McKenna, I quickly got involved with the Claremont Independent, which is the journal of conservative and libertarian political thought at the Claremont colleges, and was editor-in-chief of that publication my sophomore year. And as a result of that work, I received something called the Brindell Award, which offered an internship at the Wall Street Journal, where I worked in the summer of 2010, and that was a fantastic experience. I got to work quite intimately with the writers on their editorial pages and got to publish several op-eds and really get a sense of the journalism side of the writing world.
Well, here's another lesson, I think, for aspiring writers, especially if you are a student, to take every writing experience with the utmost seriousness, or the seriousness that it deserves, and really
Yes.
put everything you can into it, because it's all related. And I personally find that I really struggle myself to do journalistic kind of writing, the kind that is just like super clear, simple. It's and kind of jumps at you, if I'm describing it right. It's
Yes.
very hard to do.
It certainly is, especially when one is in an academic setting during business hours, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because I definitely have experienced a tension between the expectations of the editors at the Wall Street Journal and the expectations of my professors. So while professors and people in the academic world want to see writing with lots of hedges built in, so they want to see writing framed in terms of perhaps and possibly and to a limited extent, and played some role in, and lots of little ways of softening the language. And the reason for that is that in an academic context, people want to cover themselves, essentially, against criticism that they have overlooked some other factor, or have not given due attention to some trend. And within the world of academic criticism, that makes sense. But in journalistic writing, if you have 750 words for an op-ed, by the time you finish all the hedging and throat clearing of explaining to readers what the article is not and what the limitations are and how further research is necessary, you've used up your 750 words.
Yeah.
So in journalism, the demand is to be clear and to take a strong stand on something. And that has been quite challenging for me, trying to navigate both of those worlds. I feel like when I'm writing for my classes, I'm maybe being a little bit too journalistic, making too many simplifications, and then when I'm writing op-eds, I feel like I'm probably being a little bit too academic.
Good points, good points. So the next thing has to do with writing process, and that's something that aspiring writers are very interested in. So can you tell us about your own writing process, whether it's working with a partner on your own, or what are things you do which make it possible for you to come up with and actually work on and finish writing projects?
So my process for this book was as follows. I signed the contract the September of my senior year of undergraduate and spent the following 4 months or so in the initial research and outlining phase. So that consisted of a lot of interviews, reading a lot of background material, reports, UN documents, legal documents, and figuring out from that what story I was going to tell. And from that process, I then developed an outline, which became increasingly detailed as time passed, until by the end of December, I had an outline that was literally detailed down to the paragraph. I knew what each paragraph was going to say, and I had all my research done, and at that point then I was ready to actually write the manuscript. So I went on a 2-week cruise to Hawaii with my father in January of 2011, and essentially locked myself in the cabin for 8 hours a day and just wrote. I had all my research, I had my outline, and at that point then it just became a matter of putting one foot in front of the other and not letting the task overwhelm me. So I would look at the outline and say, okay, from 9 to 9:15 today, I'm going to be writing the first half of this paragraph. From 9:15 to 9:30, the second half. From 9:30 to 10 is going to be this next paragraph. And by keeping the blinders on and really taking it in those small chunks, I was able to just make progress minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week. And by the time I got off the ship, my first draft was done.
I have never heard that approach before, but I'm impressed.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things that was helpful about it, too, was that I was free on the cruise from the demands of day-to-day life. And internet was very limited, so I didn't have people Facebooking me and all those distractions. And I had 3 meals a day, all provided in a very elegant dining room, so I could really focus my attention on the task at hand.
Well, I have to add that I actually have heard of someone who wrote a rough draft of the thesis on the QE2, Queen Elizabeth II, but I don't believe he scheduled his time down to the 15-minute interval the way you did. That takes tremendous discipline.
Well, I've learned by bitter experience that if you do it any other way, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. At least from my own temperament, that would be the case.
I think it's probably the temperament for many people because it's not uncommon for writers to sit down and all of a sudden really be attracted to cleaning the bathroom.
Yes. Yes. And it's also very easy to put off writing for a few days and think, that's all right, I'll have a frenzy of work and writing on Saturday. Saturday is the day to really bang out this chapter. Well, then something comes up on Saturday, and next thing you know, then the whole week of work is null.
That's right. That's right.
So much better, I think, to set meek and unambitious daily targets and stick to them than more ambitious goals and wind up wobbling. Even 10 minutes a day, if you can actually stick to that, will really add up. Week by week, day by day, people can write manuscripts that way.
Now, I understand, John-Clark, you're a Catholic man.
Yes.
How do you see your Catholic faith as having an effect on your work as a writer?
You know, frankly, I don't see a profound connection, but I think the way it helps me most is indirectly, in the sense that my faith does inform my interactions with other people as far as how I treat them, how I am kind to them and trustworthy, and in that sense, by forming my character, I think it has turned me into a writer that people can trust and place confidence in. So when it comes to interviewing people for this book, often in sectors of the security industry that are generally rather secretive, by being trustworthy with those people and being authentic with them, I was able to win trust in a way that I probably couldn't have if I didn't really strive to express those qualities.
I see, but I would think that would also carry over into the actual writing, in that you would have to, I guess the way I would put it is, on the natural level, because, in the Catholic faith, grace builds on nature. You have to have nature first. You have to have virtues first before grace can operate. But a thing that I've thought of for students, say, of English literature, or really any subject, is you have to be at a point where you realize it's your responsibility to understand everything you read, and that when you write something, you have a responsibility to speak the truth as best you can.
Yes, certainly.
So I would say it's not that only Catholics are like that, because that's not true, and many Catholics are not. But
Yeah.
it's a demand that's inherent when you take that seriously.
Absolutely. And when it came to the process of writing this book, I certainly did really take pains to make it the best product that I possibly could. The revisions process for the book was quite a bit longer than writing the first draft, actually.
Sure.
And just as a rough calculation, I figure I spent somewhere between 8 and 9 times as many working hours on the revisions of the book as I did on the first draft itself.
Sure. And were those must have been some process of your revisions before you submitted it, and the revisions that came about after you submitted it. Is that correct?
Well, I submitted the first draft of the manuscript, and then it went under peer review for about 7 months. So in that phase, they sent out the book with my name and my co-author's name removed, and sent that to the anonymous experts, who could then look it over and make comments and send those back to me. So I received those in September of 2011. And fortunately, the reviews were pretty positive, said expand on this point, and we don't need to see as much on that point, just tweaks and edits, amplifications, essentially. So I thought, oh, good. This will be something I can finish very shortly, and we can finally get the book out and into production. Unfortunately, during that 7-month period of peer review, many new things had happened in this subject matter, which required very substantial edits to take into account the new incidents that had occurred and the new regulations that had been put in place, legal changes. And so from that, I had to really tear down into the manuscript and make very substantial changes. And then while I was doing that, the situation changed again. And then while I was making those revisions, the situation changed yet again. So I went through several iterations of that process, lasting until August 1st of last year, 2013, at which point I figured I had finally gotten ahead of the curve enough to send it out to the publishers, and they were very patient with me in that process. But it's really like trying to hit a moving target whenever you are writing on current events, because the world does not stop to allow you to write your book.
Yes. So maybe a last question here, John-Clark. What do you think's up next for you as an author? Or at least what are some things you would like to see yourself writing about?
Well, I'll certainly take a bit of a break from writing on current events. But at this point in my studies, I've been devoting a lot of attention to the impact of technological change on society and the economy. And so I imagine I'd like to do more work in that area. And at this point, then, I'm essentially taking along some infant projects and trying to figure out what will actually be viable as the next step. But as has historically been the case with pregnancy, there's a certain taboo about talking about those projects before they are too ripe. So,
of course. Makes sense. So that's really it for the questions, although you could leave us with something, which is if you have any parting advice for an aspiring writer.
Well, I would say my parting advice gets back to something I mentioned a little while ago, which is the idea of keeping the blinders on and taking projects in baby steps. And that's something that allows you to not be overwhelmed by the enormity of whatever task it is you're working on. With my peers in school, I often see them get assignments of a 20-page paper or a 30-page paper and really be overwhelmed. Think, how can I fill up all those pages?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how I approach those assignments. I start by outlining either on paper or even just in my head what it is I'd like to say, and then focus on saying that line by line, paragraph by paragraph. And then I find usually when I'm done, I have easily filled up the allotted space and sometimes exceeded it and need to make cuts. So by taking that baby steps approach, I think authors can find in themselves the discipline and consistency to keep writing, keep working on whatever project it is. And then I really think they will surprise themselves when they look back after a week or a month and see just how much progress they've made.
Well, thank you so much, John-Clark. I've learned a lot from it. It's been delightful talking to you.
Thank you. Likewise, Kevin. I appreciate it.